Our speaker today is Art Wade, who along with his bride Sydney operate Rose Petals Nursery in Newberry. They're both long-standing members of our Rose Society, and today Art will be talking about the Dudley Farms Historic State Park, which has some beautiful roses. One of the first roses I ever purchased was Dolly Dudley. And despite the fact it was named after a baby, I can tell you it's one rose you do not have to baby. It is tough as nails, it's a survivor, requires minimal care, and I think there's some available today. But I have been to the Dudley, personally been to the Dudley State Park. It is a beautiful area, it's fascinating, and it's well worth a visit if you haven't been there. Let's all give a warm welcome to our friend Colleague, Art Wade.
Thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction. As I know most of you, for those that are new, I'm Art, and I'll be talking about mainly Dudley, but one thing I did want to cover a little bit before I get started. I brought today a couple of roses that are called Xander, and many of you remember Al Whitcomb. This was one of the roses that he was a breeder. And there's one up here on the table for the raffle, but there's two others over there if you're interested. This is one of his roses that is very, very hardy. It's a great, nice sized shrub rose. So I just felt it important to bring and talk about this. It's interesting. Several years ago, there was a conference here for the Heritage Rose Foundation. Sid was in attendance, and I was working and had to come in late, and walked in and went over and, while the speaker was going on, I sat down and I'm kind of looking around, and I look back over my shoulder and I go, it was Al Whitcomb. Al Whitcomb and I had been in the Army in Germany in the 70s, and I had not seen him since then.
Oh.
So it's like, oh my gosh, we got to talking and going back over the times and adventures that we had there. But that was the background on Al and why I felt it important today to bring that and to talk about it, because he was quite the rosarian. It was something that roses was not something we dealt with when we were in Germany. We had other issues, totally different kind of problems. But to run into him this late in life, and then to have the different rose experience that how he had been active in Tampa beforehand, and then had taken in so much into the breeding. So that was just an aside I wanted to mention. But back to Dudley Farm. Dudley Farm is we have a, is it on the screen? I can't see.
It hasn't started.
No, okay.
Yeah.
I think a couple of you may have been up there for one of the conferences. They had a bus tour, and it did stop at Dudley. For those that haven't, it's a very small park, and in the state park system, the historic state parks are generally not ones that are as well known as some of the bigger parks that have the water activities, the beaches, the camping, that kind of thing. This is one that is only about 300 acres. The park itself was donated by the last of the third generation that lived in this old farmhouse. The farmhouse itself was built in the 1880s, and ultimately 3 generations of the Dudley family lived in the home. The last person to live there was Myrtle Dudley. She was the youngest of the family, the 3rd generation, and her mother had asked that the members of the family try to further the house, allow the house to be used as a educational opportunity, And as a result, they made a donation of the farm itself, about 20 acres with these 18 buildings. And that became the core of what we have as a park today. The state was able to acquire some other land around it to make up the 300 and odd acres that we see in the park today. But it is truly a working farm. These are two of the outbuildings that you'll see there. This is an example of the old school detached kitchens where this area it was real common for this to be used. So if there had been a fire in the kitchen, it didn't take the house out also. But it's been set up. The stove works on different event days out there. The groups of docents will go in and actually cook and offer some prepared biscuits. There's things that they can easily make on the stove. And then the other picture is that of what's called the syrup complex. And up until probably 10 years ago, this was still being used each fall for our cane days, where we would grind the sugar cane that was grown on the farm and then actually boil it down into the syrup. In old days, this was one of the sweeteners that was very common here in the South. It's the cane syrup. And it is an acquired taste. It's not your common thing. But being a working farm, we have animals there. These are some of the Florida cracker cattle, registered cows that are descendants of the cattle that went wild and feral from the time of the Spaniards' arrival. The mule over there is one that we had some retired mules out there that we would have for interpretive purposes. They didn't work a lot. They were mainly just for the show and how the importance of animal power back in the early part of the farming activity. I'm the past president of the Friends of Dudley Farm. And this is one of those citizen support organizations that you see active in many of our Florida state parks. And the organizations support their own individual park financially and then through volunteer and work, and that's what we do. And our work is a lot with the animals. We supply all of the feed that's used for both the cows, the horses. Now we've got some Florida cracker horses out there. The chickens, the turkeys, we get the fertilizers and amendments that are used for sugar cane and any of the other crops that are grown for interpretive purposes. So that's what's been an important thing for the park to have, is that interpretive activity. This past year, the park was designated as a historical landmark. This is a very, very prestigious title to have here. There's only like 48 of these designations in all of Florida. And this was a big meaningful event for the park. The 18 buildings that are out there are the original buildings. They were not things that were brought in. They were updated, maintained in the time period, and in order to qualify, we had to have everything as it was. It could not, we have a lot of difficulty in finding materials that of a period, like especially wood even. So much of it is now, has to be custom sawn for us to use, since everything is now been reduced in size. It's no longer dimensional. It's no longer a true 2x4 or 2x6. It's now something smaller, mill. A little bit of the background out there, the Dudley farm, the Dudley family. The the patriarch was Captain PBH Dudley, and his wife, Mary Magna. They moved from an area outside of Charleston, South Carolina. The captain originally came in about the late 1850s. then the next generation, his son, Junior, and then his children, the third generation, that were the ones that had all lived in this old farmhouse. Miss Myrtle passed in 1996 and is still in that old farmhouse. And had all kind of visitors would go out there, and we still to this day have folks come up and talk about. I remember going and talking with Miss Myrtle sitting on her front steps, or some story about her. She was quite a character. As I said, they moved originally in the late 1850s, and this property where the farmhouse was built, there was originally this double pen dog trot log cabin was where they lived. Unfortunately, that has long since been destroyed, and we can have a general idea of where the footprint was, but we don't have any pictures, drawings, or anything else that can take us back to it. So most all of the interpretive activity relates to the farmhouse that we see in this picture. Now, what's interesting is this family, besides being farmers and ranchers, the family collected a lot of plants. And to this day, around that farmhouse, you'll see not only the roses, but a whole collection of different bulbs, annuals, trees. They had several different kinds of fruit trees, citrus, some of the bananas that still grow, and the group offers them for sale. When you talk about Dudley Farm, you talk about this farmhouse, this was one of the classic swept yards. This was something that you saw often in the South or in Florida. Then when you hear the stories, it has to do with the reasoning behind it was where that you could see if there had been visitors, whether they be two-legged visitors or the unwanted four-legged ones or slithery ones. And it kind of gave you a heads up that you had company. So this was some of the stories behind why. And then of course it also added to it reduced fuel load around the house too. So that's at this farmhouse, we have the area around the building itself. You've got the decorative garden, but you also have, not far away, there's subsistence gardens. And they grow a lot of, for interpretive purposes, again, a lot of the heritage and heirloom kind of vegetables there. And some of the docents have some interesting stories of exchanges they've had with folks about growing plants and food. This is in Florida. I think it's the 5th grade. They have Florida history. And so it's real common to have the school groups come out to Dudley and so one of the docents, he tells this story about how he was dressed in his overalls and was working out there weeding. Kids come up, so he reaches down and he pulls some carrots out of the ground. And he's talking about, and this little boy raised his hand, "Mister, why do you store your carrots in the dirt?" And he said he just stood there and looked at him like, where do you start? Trying to say, they're not from Publix. So these are some of the little stories we run into in working around an old farm that is still operating as a farm and has different gardens, both subsistence and these fancy ones. In the Friends of Dudley Farm, several years ago, we built what's known as the Heritage Nursery, and it's back in the non-public part of the park where we've set up, and there's a group that do propagation and grow roses, or grow plants, not the roses, but many other things. And then they've started having semi-annual sales. And it's been growing and growing, and this year I think they made probably well over $3,000 in their last sale. but it's interesting to what reaction there was once we had the garden available, where that they had a place that they could, actually put their plants. There was irrigation, there was a workspace where they could pot up things and get seeds, and then a lot of the things they do are either from Dudley, they're Florida friendly or Florida native, or in the vegetables they'll go high into the heirloom. And
Do they save seeds and sell them too?
Some, they do have some of that, but mainly I think their focus has been thus far with actually the plants. And with the original group, they decided they were going to call themselves the Soil Sisters. So now they have T-shirts that say they're the Soil Sisters.
There's roses.
As I was saying, there's a number of roses out there. There was a lot of work from the time the park was first designated as such. Meetings with Miss Myrtle, different experts, some from universities, some just in the community that you may know. Many of you may remember Linda Rengard. She was very knowledgeable in the old roses, the Heritage Rose arena. She was one that went out there and helped in identifying roses, and then ones that couldn't identify, they are just known as with the Dudley names. These are some of the groups that have been identified there. Champneys is one that I actually brought a copy of this, and why I wanted to talk a little bit about Champneys. Of course, Champneys was first bred in the 1811 in the Charleston area, and being this is where the Dudleys were from, it was not it wasn't unheard of. We thought that for them to have had a copy of this in their collection, in their garden there. Unfortunately, there's no records that we can find that talk about the purchase or the acquisition of roses, or there's a few plant purchases, but none of the roses can we identify as to provenance back where the family obtained them. But again, we know PBH went back and forth to Charleston quite often, and this is one of the roses in their collection there at Dudley. Another one that's in the collection that is known is called F.J. Gruppendorf's. F.J. is it was fairly modern by comparison to Champney, as being from the early 1900s. But you got the story behind it is why I like telling this. Miss Myrtle was, as I said, quite the character. She was never married and was the youngest of the family and the last to live in the home. And people would come out there, and of course she was showing off her garden and would talk about the different roses and say, this is Dolly Dudley and this is Edna Dudley and this. Well, Miss Myrtle, which one is yours? She'd go point to FJ and says, that's mine. Why is that? Because it's as prickly as my personality. Okay, got it. And it is well armed. Contessa de Kayla is also known as Edna Dudley, but it was one that has, again, been identified. Several of them fall into this category, but it's the family, of course, always referred to it as Edna's Rose or Edna Dudley. It's a little bit older than the others, but it fits in with the period where these folks would have been, like anybody in farming, they would be looking at the catalogs that were available at the time, and trying to either order or get somebody else to pick it up on a trip. So it wouldn't be uncommon for them to have roses from this period in their collection. These are the rest of the roses that are on the list of identifieds, and many of them are newer, but of course Louis Philippe is such a great rose. We saw again in some of the research and some of the visiting that we've done here in Florida, Louis is seen in so many of these old homesteads, and it's just such a hardy, great old rose. But around that Dudley farm, the farmhouse itself, there's got to be at least 5 of these big old roses, and they've been sitting in those same holes for decades. And they just are just a super, super rose. And in our area, and there too, they'll start blooming as early as February, and they'll just keep right on blooming until the first freeze starts burning those buds off. I mean, we've had flowers at Christmas time at the house off of Louis. It's just that great a continued bloomer. Let's say it's very disease resistant, easy propagation. It's some that sometimes in some of the class or presentations I give up, if I'm asked about a propagation class, and this is one that I try to include because it does. They have a much better chance of a take on this than some of the other roses, but it is a great rose for that too. Another one out there that's popular, and we like it a lot at our nursery, is Mrs. BR. In our area, it grows very well, blooms a lot, has a high petal count, and is fairly disease resistant. Of the Dudley roses, I'm going to go through, and these are the ones that both Linda Ringard's actually put together a pretty good paper about it, and if you all would like, I'm going to pass this around. These are some of this is a list of the roses and just kind of a map designation of where the different plants are if you're ever out at the farmhouse, or if you, I hand this out to some people, new customers that have not familiar with heritage roses, and I said, just begin with this as your research. Check these and see if any of these are the colors or the sizes or what you would like, and it gives you an idea that these are going to do well in our area. This is one Ken just mentioned. This is Dolly Dudley, and it's on the table. There's, I think, 1 or 2 of these are available. The story behind it said it was planted way back in the 1800s, and it was named for Captain P.D.H. Dudley's first granddaughter. You know what's so interesting with these found roses, no one can tell us, it's never been identified, the true introduction name for this. But several years ago, we were contacted by some folks in Southern California, and they said, we have a rose that looks like Dolly, and it's Abbott and Burns. So everybody starts swapping pictures and plants, and they think it's the same rose. So here we have an unknown in Newberry, Florida, and probably the same unknown in Southern California, sitting at a gravesite of a miniature rose. You know, it's this kind of thing that in this heritage rose world, you end up with these little stories that are like, how in the world is, and nobody knows the true introduction on either side. It's always as though they will have their respective study names. But as Ken was saying, this is a very, very hardy rose. Ours never gets to be more than like 18 inches tall. And it has a lot of these little miniature blooms. There's a sad story here. This one is Dora, and it's one that unfortunately we've tried to get copies of all of the roses out there, but this was one that we have never had a copy of. And we've talked to people who were originally working on the lists, and so far we've been unsuccessful in anybody having a copy of this rose anywhere. So it may be one that's been completely lost to history. Fanny is one that she's a nice size white. It's not, it's introduction name is not known. And again, you can see how long this has been in the ground over there when it was first planted. Very hardy, easy to grow. Leela is one that we do have one here today, and it's a little bit different, not as high petal count. Medium-sized shrub and just nice coloring. It's a, I can't say a whole lot more about it. It's one of the suspected to be in the tea with the tea fragrance. This is one that I think, Malcolm, you can maybe speak to a little bit too on what your recollections are. I think we talked about this a little bit. It's one that Fanny, the second matriarch, she was very proud of this rose and one of her favorites. This is a good rose. It's probably a noisette. We think it has a noisette characteristic, very disease resistant, but the story behind it is the one that you see very common stories back in the old days where the neighbors would have plants that you liked, and so everybody would be sharing cuttings. So the neighbor was Mrs. L.J. Smith, and she shared cuttings with the Dudleys. And the original plant, the Smith plant, we have no idea whatever happened to it or the family, but it's now at Dudley Farm. It's Mrs. L.J. Smith. And it's one of your nice sizes. It's not a big, tall noisette, but very pretty. Classic fragrances. This rose was named for the captain, and they have identified it as all of the growth habit and all is very similar, if not identical to that of white pearl and the red dragon's mouth. These don't get to be a very big shrub, but they bloom quite a bit, and not as much as Louis, but they do keep a lot of color, and it's a little bit different with that white center to it. Again, all we know of is that it's the gate rose. It's a one-time bloomer. No stories on where it came from or any of the backstory on it. Yes. And this is one that is on the opposite end. It's a that single bloom with the white with the yellow center is just so classic for our wild roses. We see this quite often, and so there's some research going on right now that it could be one of the multifloras, but that's not been determined yet. But we think that it was somebody had acquired a rose on grafted material, and all that's left is the root stock. So that's why it's so unusual for us to try to figure out what it is. And again, we don't even have records of purchases from any of the catalogs that were very popular during the early 1900s, mid-1900s, when you would have expected for some of these different varieties to have been acquired. Well, that kind of is a summary of my presentation on the roses out at Dudley Farm, and a little bit of background on Dudley Farm. There's places like this around in Florida that have other found roses, some only one or two, but we should keep hearing about them. We've, in fact, up in Archer, there's a cemetery there that's got a rose that's now known as Laurel Hill, the name of the cemetery. And it's a found. Nobody knows the backstory on its introduction or anything else, even when it was planted, but it's been there just growing along for several decades at least. And I'm sure that you all have got similar stories with some of the founds around here. We've heard of, well, John Starnes has that one rose that came from Tampa. Connie Hilker has identified one that's found out of the Lincoln Cemetery in St. Pete. So we're growing both of those, but you know, there's, I'm sure, stories that you all have had from your areas of found roses that they got to be hardy enough to live out here, and that's some of my describing and talking to folks that come into the nursery and go, I can't grow roses in Florida. Yes, you can. Let's talk about this. Think about it. If it's from an abandoned homestead or a cemetery, and old dead people can grow roses, then what do you think you can do with a little bit of work? Anyhow, that's my presentation. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes.
Question about the soil. I'm just wondering if there's something in the soil in those areas where the roses have been there for, you know, hundreds of years. Is there anything special? Has anyone looked at the soil, done any analysis?
I don't think I've ever
special
heard of
nutrients?
anybody actually ever having done a soil analysis. Now, there could very well have been that early on before I was real active at the park, because they had a lot of interest from UF out there when the first activity about the donation was publicized, and the state made agreements to accept responsibility for the property. So I think there could have been some work done there, but I'm not familiar with it. All I know is that that area around this home has been undisturbed. It's not like it's a you know, new construction or anything. It's just
Right.
it's old soil, and what we do see from their farming practices and all, they weren't opposed to using what was available during their respective periods. So, I mean, they would have had any of the manures and all of that early on, and then if there was available fertilizers that were purchased later, they would have probably included it in their gardens, but we don't have records that would give us a lot of information on that.
Gotcha.
Okay, what time of the year do they have their sales from their nursery?
Well, we just had one, I think it was 4 weeks ago, was the spring, and then they'll do a fall one. There's a website, the friendsofdudleyfarm.org. It's the citizen support organization. It's their website. And so we try to keep that updated with events and our calendar updated, so it would be kind of a go-to point if you wanted to research it and see. But if anybody wanted to do a road trip up there and go to the park, I'm sure we could talk with some of the soil sisters, and they would be more than happy to have visitors, and would actually probably do it behind the scenes, showing off their little garden and their work that they do, as well as taking you for tours through the, you know, the actual homestead itself and the decorative gardens.
Where is Newberry Florida?
It's west of Gainesville. So if you go up 75 and at the road, you would turn east to go to the university. If you turned west, Newberry's out that way. The Dudley farm is probably 10 miles west of the interstate off of Newberry Road.
Your paper says Seven Sisters and then in parentheses, or Dorothy Perkins. Are you convinced it is Dorothy Perkins?
I'm not. I think it's Seven Sisters. That was something done before me. I'm copying a product that was the result of these two main experts. I think it's Seven Sisters.
So you think it's Multiflora platyphila? Because up in your part of the world, they also refer to Tausendschein as Seven Sisters.
No, this is I think distinctly different than that.
Is Seven Sisters a repeat bloomer? One time, okay.
But it's a big girl, big rambler.
Are
All
you in
right.
the same zone up there as we are? We're in zone 9B, I believe.
I think we're a little bit, not quite as much. Anything above State Road 50 is where the cutoff
I have
is.
Louis only been up to Gainesville, I'm really not familiar with it.
Yeah, we're a little bit cooler. But you all can do some things we can't. There's some of the subtropicals that you all can do that we just can't do up there, even with a lot of attention. But our roses, the ones that I've talked about here, I know they do very well in this part of the state too. The Dudley stuff, particularly. A lot of them are the teas and chinas, nozettes.
What about St. Pete, just a mile from the Gulf?
You know, I've got customers down there that grow all of these, but I find a lot of them are happy with all of the Bermuda roses. They love those. They seem to all do well here in the state, regardless of whether you're on the coast or inland.
I would stand to reason.
We do. We like all of them. They just are happy kids. We've got a Smith's Parish and Red Smith's Parish that we've grown together in kind of a row, and those things they're so robust. It's like a weed. You have to just, go after them because they'll just keep on
All those here.
spreading out. So Spice is Spice is one that's almost got shade tolerance to hers. There's one nurseryman had it, and it was over 20 years old, and the oak tree had spread over the top of it, and it just bloomed. He said it hadn't changed a whit how it bloomed before to now under this oak tree. But it's the group of Bermudas out of that original ones. The group that's here in the States, they all do very well.
Now, are any of those from Dr. Manner's Bermuda roses?
Yeah, they're his. That's
That's who they
that
are?
group. That's the 18 that are in the States. I think there's only about 18 or so in the States out of that 29.
Oh,
As far as we know, all Bermuda roses in the U.S. came through our garden.
wow.
That's amazing.
We've been trying, in fact, at this last conference, Sid and I were out at Shreveport, and I talked with the HRF representative, the trustee that is from Bermuda, and we talk about this all the time, how we can figure a way to get cultivars or at least budwood for the rest of the collection that are not in the States, to get them in another environment away from, not just only in the island, so that if something ever were to happen, at least there would be cultivars of those somewhere else. And so that's a continuing, ongoing discussion that we have. How can we do this? How can we get through, get it over here, get it through quarantine?
Yeah, especially with the weather patterns in today's world.
Well, it's just, you think about it, if something could happen and they could end up losing one or two of those varieties, just as we lost Doro. I mean, we don't know, I still can't find anybody that's got the cultivar of Doro. Anything else?
Great.
Well, thank you all.